Often we run into cases where data that we'd like to bring into Whisper exists in other systems, databases, maybe they're accessible through an API, or we have spreadsheets of the data that we'd like to load into Whisper. That's where our data mapping tool comes in. Essentially, what this allows you to do is to visually view data and map it to existing types and attributes, metadata on each of those types in a visual interface. Let's take a look at where this is. So data mapping exists in the admin menu. Can be found in the item here, data mapping. If we open this, it's actually going to load up the data mapping tool. Now I've currently already switched to a profile. In this example, we'll be looking at a spreadsheet. This spreadsheet actually is some information taken from an Iron Mountain export. And this represents boxes that exist in the Iron Mountain repository, or Iron Mountain storage. Again, through our data mapping tool, we can hook onto multiple different types of sources. This could be Excel spreadsheets, databases, Access databases. Whisper, our data mapping tool, is actually used to upgrade from previous versions of Whisper. SharePoint List, for example, we even have an integration with Shopify to allow us to hook on to the API of any other system, maybe through custom engagement, to bring in data. So in this particular example, we're going to be focusing on this spreadsheet that I have. You can see within this spreadsheet here, if you're not familiar, essentially it's just a flat dump of all the information that Iron Mountain has on these boxes. There's a number of columns here we'll kind of focus on when bringing this in. From here we can see we've got some departments. There's each of the boxes are associated with departments, maybe a division, customer name, for example. How can we bring in the information about these boxes, create those box types, but then further relate these boxes to each of those other pieces of data we can get from here? How do we relate it to a department? How do we relate it to a customer? How do we relate it to a classification? Through this process, we'll actually be applying classification to these boxes based on information we find in the sheet. So jumping back into Whisper, just a quick overview of the profile here. We mentioned we can have different types of sources. These can expand depending on your repository and requirements. Connection string, we can run specific queries. Maybe we're just connecting to specific tables. This could be tabs in a spreadsheet. It could be tables in a database. It could be an API call in particular. Here we can see a mapping string. Essentially, this is just the behind the scenes information we'll take a look at on the left-hand side. And the key is basically what we're mapping on. So let's actually just hop out here and look at it at work. So I'm going to start with our Iron Mountain boxes. We're going to start with just creating the boxes from this information we have here. It takes a second to load. I believe there's 20,000 lines in here, so it takes a second. And from here, you can see what I'm creating from this particular profile is called an IM box, Iron Mountain box, that's going to exist in Whisper. Take a look at our type editor video and documentation on how to create types and the metadata associated with it. This auto allows you to tie the data mapping profiles to the main sync button in Whisper. So whenever that sync button is pushed, it'll run all the profiles that are flagged as an auto run. Next area here, we can see table and query. Tables is essentially all of, here you can see I have multiple different tabs across the bottom of my spreadsheet. That allows me to select a particular tab. Table could refer to, if I'm connecting to a database, this might be a different table within the database. The query allows us to run specific queries against the incoming information. This might be a SQL query against a database. There's a query that you can run against Excel spreadsheets. This might be API information that we're sending when we run. We'll see this later example when we look at a SharePoint list. Next area here is the main area. This is all of the attributes in Whisper that are on an IM box. You can see I have SKP barcode. I have, what's another, to and from dates are going to be a big one we want to bring in here. Event dates, a long description. And essentially what we got here is as we select the left-hand side here and select attributes, the columns within the spreadsheet light up green. Anything that's green, that those are attributes, columns that have been mapped to attributes. Here, so we can see, maybe if I go across, we'll look at, we got a status. So we got status here. So this status column is green. Maybe it wasn't status column, maybe it was the valid department. You can see the column changes from green. It was highlighting status, and now we're highlighting the department. So let's change it back to status. After we've made our mappings, we go through here and say each one of these columns corresponds to an attribute. We also want to flag which attribute is the unique identifier from this sheet. So if I have an IM box already in my system with the legacy ID of the legacy ID column, update the existing one. If it doesn't exist, create a new one. So these radio buttons on the side here just essentially allow you to flag which attribute is the one you're searching for in Whisper. If it exists, update from the information you've got. If not, create a new one. So I've already run this, so I'm going to hop over back into Whisper to take a look at kind of what that looks like. Here you can see on my IM Boxes tab, I've got all my boxes that I brought in. Here you can see we've got to and from dates, and barcodes, descriptions, major descriptions. And just by simply running that and bringing this in, there's 20,000 boxes created from that spreadsheet that existed here. So what's the next step? We've got all of our boxes. You notice when we were in our data mapping tool, we had a number of columns that weren't actually highlighted. So we didn't actually bring in all the information. We're going to use some of these other columns to relate them to a department, for example, or a division. Say we'll look at divisions here. So we'll have another profile here that'll create divisions. So let's look at that. So again, we're creating a divisions type. We've got some attributes here on division, not much. Maybe we'll take a look at departments. I think there's some more here. So we've got some different departments. We looked at a different tab on the spreadsheet. We assigned it to a different object type, and we brought that in. We created departments. So we've got boxes and departments, for example. The other types of profiles we can create here is actually a relationship. So we want to relate boxes to departments. Basically, we'll take that spreadsheet, and for each line, we'll look for a department name and a box name and relate them in the system. We've created them from the first two profiles. The object relationship type of data mapping tool allows you to relate those objects. Essentially here it's saying, take my IM boxes and look at the legacy ID in the legacy ID column and map it to departments based on the name and the column called department name. So let's see what that looks like. I'll hop back into Whisper here. If I expand one of my boxes, you can see I've already run all of them. I've related them to customer, department, division, and a records category we found in the spreadsheet. If I expand the department, you can see that this box is related to the accounts payable department. You can also see that here on the right-hand side. It's populated into the drop-down, and it's also got the relationship underneath. The last area, now that we've created the objects and related them, this starts giving us a breakdown on how we can view this information differently. We want to maybe apply a classification. So here we can see we've got a classification applied. We actually do that with our data mapping tool as well. Go back into data mapping. Again, using that same spreadsheet, information that we got from within there will allow us to classify. So let's classify boxes. This is a different type of profile here. Under type, we've selected a classify object. And similar to the object relationship, we're basically going to say, what are we looking for? The IM boxes. What attribute are we basing it on? The legacy ID that we found. I believe it's over here on the right-hand side. Just find this legacy ID in here and apply the retention code based off of this column we've got here called column 2. So the retention code is going to come from column 2 here. And within Whisper, we have classifications called 10 years or none or 6 years. And then the final action is based off of the DS here is for destroyed. Again, let's take a look at what that looks like. So again, I pointed out here our classification of 10 years, DS, and we've started calculating projected dates of when these boxes that exist in Iron Mountain might come up for destruction. So that's how we can use the data mapping tool to bring in some information from databases and other places. Let's take a quick look at one more example, a SharePoint list, for example. It's going to hop over to a different repository that's got one set up for a SharePoint list. Again, I'll go into my data mapping tool. And from here, I've got a SharePoint list test. As I had mentioned before, the query here isn't a SQL query, but it's actually the API call to go out to the SharePoint API to pull in some more information. I've written one here to be able to get a couple of different custom columns from it. Within my system, I have volumes. And basically what I'm saying is, in a previous video, or in our export profile, we actually exported this information out to a SharePoint site. What this allows us to do is actually bring information back in if anybody had made updates to the SharePoint list. In this particular case, we're looking for requests. So users on the SharePoint site might have changed the request column to request that volume be delivered to them. And we can see here all the requests are none, but essentially when we sync this in, we're not bringing in the title of the volume or anything else. We just want the who edited it last and what the request is if it's true. So from here we can see requests is pulling from the request column. Last request is being pulled by who edited last. And we're just mapping on the ID. We had a column when we exported called Whisper ID, and we're matching on that when we bring the data back in. So you can be very particular and granular and drill down to particular pieces of information being pulled from different locations. You may have a spreadsheet that has the information on all your boxes. You might have a database that has which department those are related to. You might have something on a SharePoint list that tells you who has that item at any given time. You can slowly and gradually build up the data. It doesn't always have to come from one source with the ability to map on a particular metadata field. Just a quick hop out to my volumes tab here. We can just quickly see here that the information that we pulled from the SharePoint site exists in our volumes now. So I'm just going to go request and last requested by. So this is information we would have pulled from the SharePoint site, the SharePoint list.